All right. Hello, theological resistors. This is Trip.
And I'm here. Robin's here.
Boom shakalaka.
Yes, I love the crowd.
They are cheering. They say, let us resist theologically. And today we're going to be resisting patriarchy and hopefully working against our impending ecocide with Rosemary, Radford, Ruether.
You know, I don't know when you started reading Rosemary. I started reading Rosemary Radford Ruether in college. And in fact, I read her right after I read Mary Daly. So it was like a progression of feminism. So I read Beyond God the Father, Mary Daly, and a whole bunch of Mary Daly, and then got turned on to Rosemary Radford Ruether, read Sexism and God Talk, and continued reading Rosemary Radford Ruether. And in many respects, I want to say that it was really Ruether who helped me believe that we can make change from the inside.
Mm-hmm. And Rosemary Radford Ruether is a Catholic feminist theologian who, despite being a theological radical, a invested activist, has spent her career in the academy and continues to work in the life of the church. So one of the things that exist in both the articles we're looking at and exudes out of her life is a commitment both to praxis and to working for transformation in religious communities, recognizing that what we need to transition on, like how as a globe and as a people we can transition away from perverse forms of power that are death dealing. Like in order to do that, we need symbols, stories, practices, and things. And so religious communities are not things to give up on, but to re-engage in liberating ways.
Yeah, and let's also mention that Ruether spent a fair amount of time traveling back and forth to Latin America and was really invested in the resistance that was happening throughout Latin America. And I think she's fluent in Spanish, is what I remember.
As just an academic, a monster academic.
Yes.
So her book, Women in Redemption, or Redemption in Women,
Women in Redemption,
is a beautiful history of the role of women in the history of the church. God and Gaia is a book in the history of religions, like what is the role of the feminine in early religious history as religions emerge as a transition into agricultural revolution and industrial revolution. How's the role of the feminine change in understanding the divine? Like Rosemary, we're going to be wrestling with some of her intentional Christian theological reflections, but as an academic and scholar of religion, is just a giant.
She's a boss. I mean, the thing that I think is also important about Ruether is that I feel like she is not afraid of any system. And she has like this precision analysis that takes down any system when it and exposes the sexism, the misogyny, and the patriarchy, which is so important, I think, when we're thinking about resisting empire and what do theologies of resistance really look like. I also have to say she's fairly awkward in person, and as like many academics are, just awkward, and often has food on her shirt, which is charming and a little scary, right? That Trip, we have something to aspire to.
I mean, I just think that at a certain age you get extra patches, right? Like you can put extra patches on your clothing.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's got to rock it some way.
Yes.
One of the things that, and one of the reasons I think we're looking at Rosemary last is that throughout her career, she's continued to investigate religion, what roles it plays in society and culture, in shaping our communal, social, political imagination. And one of the insights that these two texts investigate is the way in which the power dynamic, the perverse power dynamic at the heart of patriarchy, is not just closed in a picture some binary version of gender, and one's more powerful than the other. That shape of power is stretched across race and class and the human and non-human life in this globe. And so one of the things about developing a theology of resistance and taking Rosemary's challenge in the second article we'll look at about re-engaging our traditions and engaging the texts and the stories and the thoughts and such for liberating purposes is that all humans are storied humans, textual humans. All are interpreting creatures that are making sense of the world by interpreting and reading text. So we need to take responsibility of the energy, the creativity, and the possibilities that are created in the way we embody, live, and engage our traditions. And patriarchy is kind of the first sour, evil, perverse fruit that is identified in her feminist work, but she uses that as a lens to recognize and understand the ways in which big cultural institutions like religions continue this problematic proposal around power dynamics.
And let's also mention that just because we're doing Rosemary Radford Ruether last, we don't believe that feminism or her work is an appendix. But in many respects, Ruether's work ties together Black liberation theology, Latin American liberation theology, and the ways in which how feminist liberation theology here in the U.S. and throughout the South and the global South has materialized has been really influenced by Ruether and some of these pioneering feminists. I also want to second what you said, Tripp, around patriarchy being the sour fruit that's sort of driving so much. I think what's really important about Ruether's work, and you can see it in some of her other work, but bubbles up a little bit here, is the importance of symbol and ritual. What people may not know is that Ruether was the brains behind, or is the brains behind, Women Church, and Women Church is some people might call it an alternative community, but it really is a gathering of like-minded people, mostly women, who subvert traditional church practices that seem to be rooted in patriarchy and empire, and recreate symbols and rituals that are liberative and that are based on feminist values. So it's very much a sort of collaborative, collective orientation to Women Church. And there's a whole book out on Women Church if you're interested, and websites about that. Someone like Mary Hunt and Diane New really embody the principles of Women Church, and I think what Rosemary Radford Ruether was doing in feminist liberation theology. Mary Hunt and Diane New, feminist liberation theologians in their right, certainly have been influenced by Ruether and many others. And so Ruether is not an appendix to resisting theologies. She helps us see a fuller picture and the ways in which this is a real entanglement, that empire and power structures are an entanglement, and the different ways that we need to resist, both through revolutionary imagination, prophetic imagination, and the ways in which our rites, rituals, and symbols need to be revolutionized so that they come from the ground up.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we should jump into the article, The Foundations of Liberation Languages, Christianity, and Revolutionary Movements, because I think it's an article, and we were talking about this before we go, where she both engages specifically the Black theology in America and Latin American liberation theologies with both an affirmation of the work they're doing in the people they're working with, and a critical response about how the language of resistance and the language of the apocalyptic, when appropriated in certain communities, undermines some of the positive growth and outwork that can come out of it.
Well, and I think what she rightly notes is that she talks about the locus of power that marginalized people, the oppressed communities, embody this primary locus of power of what? Of theological discernment, judgment, repentance, and human history. What we've not talked about here is the importance of discernment in our resisting theologies. And so I think when we begin to look at those who are most impacted by multi-system oppressions and power and control, systems of power and control, I think we begin to articulate a new fold of theological discernment. And in many respects, she uses the classical hermeneutical circle, right? Discern, judge, and act. And for her, both the discernment and the acting are rooted in feminist values that destabilize the patriarchal power, the heteropatriarchal power, and the ways in which, in many respects, patriarchal power means violence and disruption of communities.
Yeah, so the way that Rosemary sets up liberation language is to point out a number of things like that the language of liberation, the way in which the history that you're engaged in is described as the very context where God chooses sides with the oppressed against the oppressor. That language has a history, and it's one where the role of the prophet becomes what she dwells on first, where she says that the prophet does not stand apart from the sinning people, but in suffering solidarity with them. Salvation cannot be divorced from self-criticism. That early in the prophetic tradition of Israel, the prophet is simultaneously announcing the judgment and wrath of God and going through this process with the people. Over the history of Israel, when the prophetic tradition leads to the emergence of apocalyptic imagery and apocalyptic judgment, then this material battle for liberation and transformation moves to this apocalyptic cosmic register, and the dualisms of us versus them get more intense. And it's there in this apocalyptic, more sectarian expression that model of language becomes the source for theologies of liberation and revolution. And what Rosemary wants to point out is that is the same language that the church then latched onto as Constantine received it. It morphed that language in a perverse way.
Yeah,
right? Like that the church in Christendom, and she talks about this on page 76. She said, in the 4th century, the capacity of the empire to integrate its power through the traditional culture was exhausted. It turned then to Christianity, and the church emerged with the empire to create Christendom, or the Christian Roman universal state. With this success, the messianic vision lost its relation to the prophetic tradition and was converted into a ruling class ideology. The messianic language ceased to be a reality discerning medium which uncovered the tension between God's will and human ways. Instead, it became reality repressing device that sanctified new imperial power in Christ's name and asserted that Christendom itself was the millennium, or the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, which was to precede final glory. The Constantinian establishment of the church went hand in hand with a privatistic and otherworld spirituality. And the prophetic and apocalyptic traditions, which are talking about the radical transformation of the material order, then becomes the very language that Christendom uses to talk about the horizon of the individual spirituality while justifying the church reign over the material order.
So I think it's important probably to point out how that has continued.
Really? How's that continued, Robin?
I know that's a big surprise to you, Tripp, and maybe to those listening. But this methodology has continued, and we see it in, for example, the exportation of homophobia to the African continent, and the ways in which a particular religious fundamentalism is part of this Christendom or part of this universal Christian state. And it's something we need to wrestle with, and it's something we need to sort of bring to the fore, that, I know that everybody's wanting to queer the church or whatever they want to do. But unless we really deal with the roots of some of these problems, we are not going to achieve a vision for the church or for this country that has unhinged from Christian supremacy and white supremacy. And so I really want to caution people from turning to fad ideas. We need to, I think, be real basic right now and return to the foundations of some of these thought leaders who really gave birth to what I call activist theology, and is the impetus for me becoming a theologian and for me doing the work that I'm doing. And so I think we need to be real careful about the ways in which today Christianity is a national religion, one, sort of national white supremacy, that religion, and how the liturgy of this national religion is one that is rooted in violence, which is the same thing that was happening during Constantine.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're baptized by the sword or killed by the sword, right? So we need to remember that imperial power reigns, and we are still fighting against Babylon.
Yeah. And I think one of the, on page 77, one of the areas where Rosemary emphasizes this, and is powerful to me, is where she says, the transcendence of heaven over earth was inward and upward, rather than standing as the ultimate horizon that judges and renews the world. So the prophetic vision, the apocalyptic vision, this radical rupture of God's arrival in the world, was no longer something that judges the world as it is and demands and calls and names potentialities of more beautiful, just relations, right, on the horizon before us. It was turned inward and turned upward. And if you just think of it that way, when faith is something that looks in, it becomes about your own spirituality, your own mindfulness in relationship to yourself and the anxieties and things around you. When it goes upwards, it's to heaven, where the solution's already established, rather than looking out at the community around you and looking down at those whom you've ignored and kept underfoot. And what Rosemary is saying is that when you combine this Constantinianism, where the world God dreamed of has already arrived and you're a beneficiary of it, and with this otherworldliness, where that to which we kind of give our allegiance to and put our hope in is external than this world, then it sanctifies everything that's in your society as already being what is necessary and demanded and dreamed for by God. And it takes the language of sin and salvation and puts it in a therapeutic relationship to the world and a complementary relationship to the world, rather than a critical prophetic one. And that it's that morphing when this top-down Constantinian embodied patriarchal picture of power gets inserted into the prophetic apocalyptic tradition from which Jesus came, that we realize how patriarchy is the power picture that funds imperial religion, white privilege, and such.
Yeah. So I think it might even just be helpful to maybe talk about how this is showing up today. And I can give an example, and maybe while I'm giving my example, you can also share an example of where you see this Constantinian religion, this Christendom religion, empire religion. So when I think about this, I think about, if we're thinking about the ways in which patriarchal power is at the root of practices, I think about the ways in which the 2016 election, and I'm not trying to be pro or against the GOP or the Democrats, but I do want to say that particular election unmasked, it was apocalyptic, it unmasked what people of color have been living with for decades. And the full-on supremacist logic that then has come from the signing of executive orders and from policies that have been legislated against the oppressed, against marginalized communities, I think is one way that this Constantinian imagination has roots here in this country. Again, I'm neither pro GOP or Democratic Party. I'm just saying we live with a complicated notion of the fusion of church and state through something that I call empire religion.
Well, I think one example of it is just when you could see staffers of Obama sending out pictures of children in chain link fences. Then they find out they were working in the White House when that happened.
Yeah.
Like, and so oftentimes it's not until you are out of the place of power that the reality of what the power that you were stewarding does can even be acknowledged.
Right.
And that's not it's not a big deal what Trump's doing. Yeah, it is. It's not to minimize that. It's just to say there is this sense, and I love the image that Rosemary Radford Ruether uses, that the United States came to regard itself as the white knight ordained by God to police the world. And white knights in quotes, because apocalyptic language is one where there is such a strong dualism of good versus evil, white versus black, that it becomes oblivious when your identity is as the white knight that to what's going on. Like all of a sudden the world is experienced as what your ideology proclaims it is.
Yeah.
Right. So then America is just doing what America does, and what we're doing is good for the world. And what we end up doing is holding intact the power we possessed post in this kind of like post or neo-colonial type of environment.
Which of course she says self-justifies the ideology that sanctifies the status quo.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And I want to say also, I think why we think I would call this a movement moment, and why you and I are interested in this particular conversation, and I think this will resonate with you, Tripp, is that like Rosemary said on page 77, the renewed apocalyptic perspective flowed underground in peasant revolutionary and left-wing sectarian movements of the Reformation, despite its continued repression by the mainstream of the new Reformation establishments. In many respects, though Tripp and I have a PhD in theology and can argue the ontological proofs for the existence of God until we turn blue, I know you'll like that, Tripp. What is at the heart of this Theologies of Resistance reading course is to really be an affront to the establishment and to really revolutionize our thinking and to help raise up a new apocalyptic perspective in what we're calling, dismantling slaveholding Christianity and leaning into the moral courage of a prophetic imagination. This is at the heart of Rosemary's work.
Yeah.
And she's a Catholic. She's a Catholic. She's a persisting Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. So
a persisting and resisting Catholic.
Yes. So she's like she's in the deep establishment, right? And even she has the moral courage to stand up to the ways in which the establishment not only fails her, but those around her.
Well, what you just shared made me think of probably my favorite page of all the reading we read, which is page 80 in this article. And I read it, teared up a bit, reread it, and wrote, can this new movement emerge? And so at the top of the page, Rosemary says, the great messianic visions of judgment and liberation have suffered new co-optation and provide the rhetoric of a new imperial power systems astride the world. Dare anyone, when then use this language afresh to make new judgments and raise up new hopes.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's dare.
Yeah.
Should we not just withdraw, seeking private places of peace and purity, calling down a plague on both their houses? No. By the end of the 60s, new forms of mysticism and dropout spirituality have become powerful movement among the disenchanted American radicals for precisely these reasons. And then she says, the task of the prophetic remnant, and this is talking about the prophetic remnant in the church,
Yeah.
that understands this message, is to find in each new situation the real plumb line between good and evil, between human hope and human self-deceit. This means a constant struggle to clarify anew what established society always seeks to confuse. It means a constant effort to demystify the domestication of the Messianic kingdom, which transforms prophecy into ideology and turns the revelatory instruments of judgment and hope into tools of self-sanctification and the repression of criticism. Oh, junk.
Yeah.
And then she gives this image of the church.
Which is beautiful.
In this sense, the task of the church, the discerning community. I love the church as the discerning community is not to abstain from the great liberation movements of history, because these movements are necessarily relative in their prophetic visions, and in distinction of good and evil that they reveal is ambiguous and not absolute.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to. I just gonna end up reading the whole page.
I mean, we can continue reading this because it's so beautiful. And I think, when I was initially reading this in college, in my little West Texas college university, Hardin-Simmons University, I would carry these stacks of, I think I've said this before on an episode with you, but I would carry these stacks of feminist theology books with me because I was the only queer person in my classes, the only person of color. And so I would carry these stacks of books, and they were my witness in the classroom. And I think that, only now, so many years out of college, do I have an appreciation for what she's writing and the importance of what does it mean to create or to mobilize a discerning community. And in many respects, that's why we're having this conversation, is so that we can not only renew our minds with theologies of resistance, but become a discerning community so that we can live out our faith in action, right? Because a faith without works is dead.
Yeah, and she goes on right after that to just say that, just like the task is discerning the moment, seeing what the plumb line of good and evil is in a moment, where human hope and human self-deceit meet, is that, this is straight up tweetable theology. The church, in participating in such movements and attempting to lift up the true revelatory moment that they express, must not lend itself to absolutizing this moment as the final incarnation of God's Spirit in history.
Yeah.
It must not fuse with it to create new Christendoms. The church must attempt to retain the autonomy of the critical principle, the ultimate salvific vision itself, which lies still beyond the accomplishment of particular revolutions.
Well, I think what she's saying here, not fuse it with to create new Christendoms. I think American Christianity continues to do that.
Yeah. No, even just imagine how many people that are representing leadership in all sorts of different American denominations and such. Imagine that, whatever their new cause is or whatever, like when we do this, we'll finally be the church as God always wanted it here.
Yeah.
And then the people will probably return back to church, or they'll hear the gospel or whatever. The picture of the church as a discerning community here is the community that gathers with both hope and clear vision to look at the world as it is, demystified from the ideology of the nation state as the protector and provider of justice. And she calls it the humanizing mission of revolution.
Yep.
And I think it's important to get that. Like, part of us as part of the church as a discerning community, it also means it's a truth-telling community. And though the truths we proclaim on behalf of justice seeking do not negate the truths we proclaim on behalf of the radical affirmation of each human and their dignity before God.
Right.
Right. So part of it being a humanizing mission is that we recognize, this is why she wants to rehabilitate language of like sin and salvation.
Yeah.
Recognize that humans are so screwed up, like so screwed up, that the very oppressors also have a human subjectivity that's perverted and diminished. And we're all this weird mixture of oppressor and oppressed, victim and violator.
Yep.
And that underneath the call for stringent revolution and transformation of social, cultural, historical periods and such, for transformation of religious and political institutions, is a recognition that the movement, the revolution, is for a humanizing community where the dignity of all is recognized.
That's right.
And that's something which means the horizon of our apocalyptic language of good versus evil is descriptive of principalities and powers, using biblical language, or institutions and cultures, that no human being is ultimately evil and valueless.
Yep.
And that gives us a mission as progressive Christians in movements to be an advocate of the potential dignity and humanity of the other on the other side of the picket line or the march. And that's hard.
Well, I mean, I think I said last week or the week before around, you talk about we both embody victim and oppressor. I mean, I talked how, men are also victims of patriarchy. But we don't recognize that. And what we end up doing is reducing all men to being evil without recognizing the deep humanity that men embody. And I think I've said to you before, Trip, you are a recipient of your socialization and the cycle of socialization and the ways in which you've revolutionized your thinking. There are still, seeds of your socialization, and together in deep community, in a discerning community, we come to live the best humanity. I mean, this is why I think my teacher in seminary, whom I adore and love, Dr. Nancy Bedford, said in class, the church is the best thing we have on earth. It's also the thing that is like full of both victim and oppressor, right? But the great thing about the church, I think, and I would say Little C Church because I'm a lifelong Baptist and I grew up in this evangelical tradition, is the best thing about the Little C Church is that it has the capacity to be the discerning community that actually mobilizes a prophetic vision. This is why I think rights-based policies and politics and rights-based theologies are unhelpful, because it doesn't help us. Or rights-based theologies identity-based theologies evacuate a prophetic vision that the discerning community can hold. I mean, I might piss off a few people by saying that, but I'm also not a liberal in the classic sense. I know that's a big surprise.
I know. I thought we were. Never mind. I'm gonna pass. So when Rosemary sets this vision up, what I think she's wanting us to do is to recognize the way in which the prophetic dialectic emerges in the different liberation theologies. And the prophetic dialectic is that relationship, the dynamic between ideology, where the language of God, God's kingdom, God's reign and stuff functions as an ideological cover for oppression, and where it functions as judgment on what's already the case. Yeah. And the history is engaged in a dialectic, what's there, and she emphasizes the way in which Cone flips the white and black imagery, right, of the apocalyptic, so that the solidarity that God has with the with the oppressed, comes with this inverted language, and so you get shocked. And we talked about that with like this notion of God being black and such. And she points out something similar with the liberation theologies in the way in which they talk about the vantage point of, like, you can't talk about the resurrection without a cross, just like you can't talk about the gospel today without the crucified people. And
So
they both have these inversions in them.
I think that's brilliant, right? That she points this out, but I would love for us, I, as a mixed race Latinx with white passing privilege, I want, my work is invested in bridging with white people and really this deep companionship with white folks. And I can imagine that some of the folks listening who read this on page 82, where she talks about the symbolism, the white in the first full paragraph, whiteness becomes a symbol of evil. I can imagine that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And I want to be very careful in reducing whiteness to evil, because I think it's more complicated than that. I think white supremacy, I think neo-fascism, neo-Nazis, that may be a symbol of evil. But whiteness in and of itself is not evil. I mean, we have the capacity to be transformed and changed. If we're going to reduce whiteness to evil, then we are not advocating for having the capacity for change.
And I think that's the one of the larger critical pushbacks Rosemary's doing to the way in which even these contemporary theologies of resistance, how they have their limits of usefulness.
Yeah.
And near the end, she says that, let's see, the language of absolute confrontation between black and white, qua good and evil, also leads to various delusions on the part of those well-meaning whites converted to sympathy for blacks.
Yeah.
They are led into an endless journey of self-rejection and identification with another group, which ethnically they can never join.
Right.
This leads to a romanticizing of the poor and a moralistic vilification of one's own people, so typical of sections of the American white left in the later 60s and today. Confusing systemic condition or violence from, confusing systemic condition with personal virtue. Such persons are ill-equipped or ill-prepared to deal with the hostility or violence from blacks and failed to develop lines of communication with their own constituencies. They were led into self-defeating efforts to join the oppressed and neglected the tasks in which they could really be useful to the oppressed, namely, creating some understanding, change of heart, and relinquishment of power in sectors of the dominant society.
Yeah. I mean, Ruether is really useful here. And I think part of it is because of her feminist values. And I think Cone's voice is a prophetic voice. We need to listen to him. And also, I can imagine that for people reading Cone and reading that blackness is true, authentic humanity, that there are a lot of non-black people who are going to feel left out, right? And so it's a tricky line, right? Because how do you advocate for authentic humanity in the face of anti-black racism, especially in this moment, and anti-brown racism?
Well, I think two things. One is if and we talked a little bit about it when we talked about Cone, there's a difference between the language functioning in some absolute way, literally and figuratively, in the sense that the West and white supremacy is so normative in the West,
right,
that inverting the language gives the appropriate symbolic transvaluation of white supremacy that can facilitate a more liberated in hermeneutic and engagement in the world. And the other thing about it, and this might just have been my experience, I remember the first times reading Cone going, like, I was just so shocked. And it's like half the page of every page, I automatically am like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then going, then why are you saying this? in my head, I'm wanting to defend my friends who I think will be offended by it. That's
Right.
exactly what was going on.
Yeah.
And even if I wasn't, I'm like, yeah, but you could say it differently, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And part of what Cone emphasized, I think it's in the preface to when they re-released one of the books, was like a black theology of liberation wasn't really written for white theologians primarily.
That's right.
And it was looking at the African American community in the church and going, all this stuff about your blackness and your complicated relationship to the church and your history is all tied up in this beautiful retelling of theology.
Yep.
And that white Christianity has not needed that. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing about white Christianity where it needed a retelling because you didn't know you had a place, a voice, a contribution to make. White Christianity needs a retelling so that what's normative isn't slave-holding Christianity.
Right. Exactly. Yes, absolutely. And the retelling needs to come probably from those who are most impacted by slaveholding Christianity and those who are in solidarity with those people, right?
And there's something Cone said, I think both are important. But I like in that article on the Academy, at one point he said, why has there never been one white American theologian that racism was their issue?
Right.
Now, that since then, I know a few, right, like who are wrestling with it, and it's a big deal. But I do think there's something, it is an important work for Anglo-American theologians to re-articulate the faith in a constructive, critical way, where their footnotes demonstrate having heard, and where the content and transformation of the doctrines recognize or demonstrate having been heard and transformed by other voices who have been systemically silenced and dismissed in the Academy and the life of the church.
Yeah, I mean, let's also talk about how white Christianity, slaveholding Christianity, it doesn't have to talk about race. It doesn't have to deal with race. Why? Because white is the norm, right? So there's also that. So all to say, it's very complicated, and I have an investment for whiteness not to be reduced to evil, because whiteness in and of itself is not evil.
Mm-hmm. So, wow. We really got going on the first one.
I mean, we're almost out of time here.
We need to talk about ecofeminism.
Let's do it.
And what do you want to kind of just explain what ecofeminism is?
I mean, my sense is ecofeminism is the relationship or the collaboration of feminism with ecology, and really looking at ecology with feminist values. Out of which we get something that's called ecofeminism. And of course there's womanist ecofeminism, there's Latina ecofeminism, and it's a really concern for the natural environment, and it's a concern for the ways in which patriarchy in particular has not treated the natural environment in sustainable ways. And so ecofeminism is an attempt to acknowledge that and then create strategies to address our dying world.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think that's important to emphasize is that about feminism, especially in the American church, is that it first emerged as, middle class and up white critical movement, right? That feminism first emerges, and one of the reasons feminists were heard and might still be heard before a lot of other liberation theologies are heard is because people are married.
Right.
And so one of the insights of the feminist movement, or one of the things the feminist movement has modeled theologically to the rest of the church, is how you can both simultaneously continue to pursue beautiful critical insights that your movement developed, right? That patriarchy exists at the heart of Western religion, and be impacted and transformed by critiques from other communities, be it communities that go and say, oh, feminist theology is really upper middle class white feminist theology,
Right.
and you're impacted and then you can be impacted by here deep ecologists and those that are recognizing the ways in which the not only are women demeaned historically by associating them with quote nature or the body and this type of thing, but that very same logic that dismisses women and puts them down connects. It's the same way humanity in its post-industrial environment has preserved a rhetoric to dismiss and demean nature itself.
Right.
And in the feminist movement has constantly gone on to incorporate insights within itself about not just gender, but race and class and ecological degradation. So one of the things I love about this article, and since we won't give it as much time, you should all read it and we can talk more about it in the Facebook, is this is an example of Rosemary writing an article she couldn't have written 30 years before.
Yeah.
This is what it looks like to be transformed by other people speaking into you in a graceful and passionate way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the brilliance of Rosemary's work is that she's in deep conversation with a lot of different scholars and a lot of different disciplines. And she brings these disciplines into the Theological Academy in a way for us to think about them in like, because it's about liberation.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to say that, as there is womanist ecofeminism and ecofeminism, there's also queer ecology, which takes queer theory in the conversation of ecology, and these are all important discourses. If you're looking for a queer ecology person, you can look to Jake Erickson, who's a white gay guy trying to think deeply about ecology, the natural world. He comes from a farming community in North Dakota, and deeply tied to land. And I think the other thing that we should think about is land, and I think I said this last week or the week before, empire is always built off the theft of bodies and the theft of land. And so ecofeminism is also addressing the ways in which the subordination of women and men is promulgated by male domination. And so how do we actually deal with androcentrism and male domination in this complex world in which we live? Ecofeminism is a step in addressing that.
On page 74, Rosemary says something which totally connects with what you just said, and also gives us a chance to talk about a fun new word. This socioeconomic form of ecofeminist analysis sees the cultural symbolic patterns by which both women and nature are identified with each other as an ideological superstructure, by which the system of economic and legal dominion of women, land, and animals are justified and made to appear, quote, natural and inevitable within a total patriarchal cosmovision. Ecofeminists who stress this socioeconomic analysis underlying the patriarchal ideology of subordination of women and nature also wish to include race and class hierarchy. So when she's talking about the revelation of an ideological superstructure, this is nerd speak for why the theft of land and theft of bodies is just normal and natural, and I don't see what the big deal is.
Right.
Right, like that. What she's saying is, when you start to use this analysis, when you start to think critically about how religion, cultural history, and things fund this, it's what are the ways in which the world as you were handed comes already interpreted with the dictionary of patriarchy just sewn in
and packaged, right?
Right.
Already interpreted and packaged.
Like, why is it no one has to say anything I kept track of stats as a youth minister of who speaks without being asked.
Yeah.
And even at a very progressive church in Los Angeles, the men much more volunteer to speak. Is it because their parents said, now look, Sally, you're a female, so don't talk as much?
Right.
No, there's this ideological superstructure. It's not something one person sits around looks at, examines, says that's a good idea, and passes it on. It's the water that everyone was breathing when they were born in the world, and then their kids do.
Right. It's a thing.
Yeah, and it's a in what Rosemary does in this article, which if you aren't familiar with ecofeminism at all, or the different forms of it, she is wanting to resist in the ecology movement the desire to understand our past as this pre-history that if we just went back to, patriarchy wouldn't be there and we'd love the earth. That there are people who tell history and tell the origins of humanity and culture in ways that there used to be this time. There was matriarchy and there was equality and humanity loved the earth. And she said, it's not that simple. It's not like agriculture and more traditional forms of religion emerge and all of a sudden patriarchy exists.
So you think Wonder Woman is a myth?
And what does she say? Myths don't have to be actual to be useful. Something like that. And I just say that because the tendency she's describing in the kind of ecological movement to say there was a time where all of humanity and animals all loved each other in a kumbaya. Yeah. That is also a desire in Christians where they say, I want to go back to biblical Christianity.
Right.
Or you get disillusioned with your fundamentalism and you become Catholic or Orthodox. Or you're like, let's return to the creeds or whatever. What she's saying is a part of doing the hard work of both deconstructing these death-dealing dualisms, which she unpacks on page 76 and 77 so beautifully, and engaging and relating to your heritage, your traditions, your texts and symbols, is there is no place to go back to that has solutions for a humanity that is killing itself in the planet it lives on.
Yeah.
You have to take responsibility for the water you're breathing and passing on to your kids. The superstructure we have long ignored, which has indoctrinated people into this death-dealing logic of patriarchy that is killing the planet and the poor and putting down bodies and land, is something we have to actively resist. And to do so, we got to start filtering the water. We got to go read the tradition differently. We have to do all these things. And I love the fact that she doesn't think you can go to some pristine other place where you can leave the historic traditions behind, or go back in time to this perfect place. But she insists that no, we're all inscripted in this thing, so let's seize our moment, our responsibility, and see what we can do with it.
So I also want to say that this is like the heart of what we're trying to do. We're not trying to resurrect an idealized past. We are not even trying to resurrect an idealized future. But what we are talking about is a normative horizon that is grounded in justice, and a normative horizon that is rooted in a prophetic imagination that creates conditions for justice. And some of that work means doing this hard work of resistance and unhinging from empire religion that tells us we should be buying our coffee at Starbucks instead of coffee CSAs, for example. We've gone an hour trip on this.
Oh, that's crazy.
How do we do that again?
Oh, I don't know. But so, thinking of all the stuff in the article we didn't talk about.
Yeah.
What part do you want to raise to the conversation? Because we can always talk about it more in the Facebook group. And, see, I thought we were going to talk about the first one quickly and then dig into
I know. I mean, I feel like the ecofeminism is so important because we need to figure out how to care for the earth. I think I want to just lift up. I feel inspired to go read some more Ruether and to sort of sit down. I think what I want to raise up is, as we're trying to figure out what are our strategies for resisting, let us remember that the work the work is always inside of us to change ourselves so that we could change the world. And the work is always outside of us. And the thing that I love about Ruether is that she is very mindful around the imperialism of this country. And she's always mindful of the impact of what happens in other parts of the country. And if we can hold in tension both the need to change ourselves and with sort of an eye toward the stranger, we might be able to build a discerning community that whose normative horizon is justice making. I think that's the last thing I want to say.
Yeah. The two things that pop to mind are, one, she uses the image of compost.
Yes.
As to how the dead things in the past can serve life in the present. What does it look like to relate to our mixed histories as a nation, as a church, and things as compost? What has needed to die so dead that it becomes fertilizer for something it would never have acknowledged or seen as part of itself?
Yeah.
I thought that composting image is powerful.
Yeah.
And then she briefly mentions two parts of the biblical tradition to latch onto that are expanded in her book, Gaia and God, an ecofeminist theology of the earth, of earth healing, which is a great text. She said, Western Christians need also to free themselves from both their chauvinism and escapism to be able to play with the insightful aspects of their Jewish, Greek, and Christian legacies, as well as critically appraising its problems, letting go of both the need to inflate it as the one true way or repudiate it as all toxic waste. The two patterns of biblical thought that are important resources for ecological theology and ethics are covenantal ethics and sacramental cosmology. Covenantal ethics gives a vision of an integrated community of animals, humans, and land that seek to live by a spiritually encoded continual rest or pattern of continual rest, renewal, restoration of just sustainable relations between humans and other humans, humans and the land, in one covenantal order of a caretaking God. And sacramental cosmology is cultivating a sense of the whole cosmos come alive as the bodifying forth of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
The bodifying forth of the Holy Spirit. Like, what is it like to cultivate a picture of the world as the very place the body of the Holy Spirit is becoming live?
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do with resisting the other side of the ecofeminist critique we haven't talked a lot about, which
right.
we have, if we got there, which is scientific, reductionistic, mechanical pictures of the universe and the economicization of life, land, and bodies.
Right.
And, you know, if y'all have so much fun doing this course and you're like, oh, we should do 4 more weeks and it'll be fun, like, just we need to resist theologies together some more, you should let us know, because
what we may do is a convening.
I guess we might convene. Right now, as you're watching this, it's in the middle of Theology Beer Camp. We're convening personally right now.
Right. But I'm thinking, when could we convene? When could we convene our people and really have robust conversations? So I don't know. Talk about that in the group. You can let us know, because Tripp and I are people. We like to be with people.
Yeah. And we have some ideas of things we'd like to come do in towns across the South.
Yeah.
So we'll put some info in the Facebook group for you to click on, share, and such, because, you know, like, what's more fun than hanging out with awesome humans on the internet?
Or in person.
No, hanging out with them in person. That's more fun.
Yes.
Because you can't hug over Facebook. If you've just finished reading Rosemary, Radford, Ruether with somebody, there's nothing quite like a pint and a hug.
Yes, give them a hug.
And that.
In fact, y'all should be reading together with your friends.
Yeah.
Theology done with friends is better theology.
And Mosaic hops, it's even better.
I'm just saying.
So, Robin, I just want to thank you tons for doing this. It's
Yeah,
been
it was good to be here.
a blast, a treat, and it reminds me how much fun it is to do things like this with people you think are zesty.
Yes.
And thank you all for sharing in the group, interacting and such. We appreciate it all, and make sure that to continue to follow all that Robin's doing. You go check her out on the internet.
Check them out.
Yeah, them out.
Yeah.
On the internet. irobin.com.
Yep. And then my project is Activist Theology.
Which soon will be launching a podcast.
Yep. Soon.
So buckle your theological safety belts.
Yes. And get your beer on.
You got to get something on.
Yeah.